very proud of my parents. I'm very pleased to see that they're appreciated by so many people in different ways, different groups of people. I mean, absolutely devoted to Maynard Dixon, or other groups of people absolutely devoted to Dorothea Lange.
For a long time, I didn't think that my parents were extraordinary because I thought everybody had parents like that. How was I to know? It's only later on that you begin to really understand how exceptional they were.
Well, my father was something of a San Francisco character, and he was kind of known as a character in the art circles. And my mother, she said that she heard these footsteps above her studio, distinctive kind of footsteps, and she kept hearing these footsteps. And finally she asked somebody, who is that? And they said, oh, that's Maynard Dixon. Haven't you met him? Maynard came down and they met, and it went on from there. Learning to be an artist. Ha-ha. Carson City. That's my brother Dan.
I loved him a lot, and he loved me. He was 50 when I was born. And he was frail. So he wasn't the guy to do the roughhouse with the kids. My mother took photographs, some photographs of me with him. You can sense some of that feeling in those photographs. Because I looked up to him. He wasn't a pal. He was above and beyond that.
I remember going out with them in the late afternoon on a sketching trip, and taking our food with us, and building a fire and cooking steaks a la Maynard. You put them right on top of the coals. A good time like that, and watching them work, especially Maynard, watching that hand going. That's wonderful.
I'd look out into the desert when he was sketching or doing with preliminary paintings, and I couldn't see what in the world it was interesting out there. And then I'd look down at what he was doing, and then I could see that the shadows were really that violet, and that the sky was really that blue. But until I had the evidence in the form of his painting, little painting, I couldn't see it.
First trip I took into the Navajo country, I was 40 years old. When I went there, I felt that it wasn't the first time I'd been there, because I'd been around my dad's paintings all this time, and it wasn't unusual to me or unknown.
And he used to sometimes come to school once in a while. Boy, that was always an event. He'd come in his city costume, right? His black suit and his black Stetson hat and his black hand-tooled cowboy boots and his ebony silver-headed sword cane. And the teacher, they all knew who he was. And they'd say, Mr. Dixon, won't you take a piece of chalk and go to the blackboard? And then he'd say to the kids, what do you think I should draw? And the kids would all say, do me, do me. And sometimes he'd do them, and sometimes he did cowboys and Indians, and his left hand would travel over that blackboard. I tell you, I was a hero. Nobody else had a dad who could come to school and do that.
My relationship with him in my early years was one of his little boy in his studio and around, and then the divorce came, and that changed that. I was still his boy, but I only saw him for you know, not the constant time that I did prior to that divorce, but would see him occasional weekends, and then maybe in the summertime travel with him. And those were wonderful times.
Within him, he had a lot of knowledge and understanding of things that were mysterious to me, that he could see things that I couldn't see. And I felt that way about him until he died. We never got to the point where we were equals. I finally got to that point with my mother at the end of her life. Took me a long time to get there. But I never got there with my dad because he died in 1946 and I was 21.
This is one of my favorite photographs of my mother. And this is a photograph of my mother was relatively healthy, and it shows it. She looks wonderful. She looks at peace, and look at the wonderful ring and bracelet. And her own individual way of dressing, you know, she was stylish in her own way.
I scarcely remember my mother when I was young. I remember my father much more vividly. I remember, of course I remember her in bits and pieces and snatches, but I remember their hands always smelled like chemicals.
I used to spend time with my mother in the dark room. You know, I used to go there and sit with her and at the end of the counter and rock the hypo band. So I used to see these images appear in the hypo. I've often wondered whether I was, along with her, was one of the first people who ever saw some of these famous images, like the White Angel Breadline or even the Migrant Mother.
She did not describe herself as an artist. And Ansel Adams, among others, used to be very impatient with her because he wanted her to be an artist. He wanted her to think of herself as an artist. Because that's the way, what he thought was the legitimate purpose of a photographer, to become an artist. My mother didn't care about that. She cared about the value of the work and the content of the work, but she didn't care about the definition of it.
My mother was a hard-driving person and drove herself. I mean, I remember her saying to herself many times, "Not good enough, Dorothea. Not good enough. Not good enough, Dorothea." When nobody else, she didn't think anybody else was within earshot. I'd hear that.
One of the reasons that she is, in my opinion, an incomparable photographer of the human face is because she perceived the human face as a universal language. No matter who you are, where you are, you can understand happiness, grief, rage in any language, so long as it's the language called the human face.
But with Dorothy, the contemplation of death came almost like peaks and valleys. I mean, she was very deathly ill in 1945, and she recovered from that. And she's back in the hospital. These ulcers were giving her a terrible time. And after that was over, then it was the cancer got her. So it was just a roller coaster. But she met it very bravely, and she said, "This is time. This is time." She knew it was coming, and this is the time. Carson City. My brother Dan in New Mexico. Taos. Carson City again. Dan and my dad in San Francisco.
Both Maynard and Dorothea, wherever they established a home, it was a home. It was always interesting, always simple, always beautiful, no matter where it was. That's a pretty good inheritance, isn't it? My father had a special feeling about corn. To him, it was, as it was to the Indians, almost sacred. And he did dozens upon dozens of drawings of them. My dad had a set of beliefs which he shared a lot with the Native Americans. He valued the fact that they didn't yield to the Christian orthodoxies, that they were proud and independent, and that they adhered to their ancient ways. And he learned some of the language, and he learned their songs, and he learned their ceremonies.
Maynard built this sweat lodge out of canvas and rocks. You'd build a fire and heat up these stones and get them hot, and roll them into the sweat lodge, and get a sprig of sage and water and sprinkle them on the rocks and create the steam. He became devoted to portraying the Southwest in a manner that he thought was true. 19. At last I shall give myself to the desert again, that I and its golden dust may be blown from a barren peak, broadcast over the sunlands. If you should desire some news of me, go ask the little horned toad, whose home is the dust, or seek it among the fragrant sage, or question the mountain juniper, and by their silence they will truly inform you. This is called Alone. Now she is gone. The numb hours turned undirected, as in a cinema show the people pass dreamily, without color, voiceless, meaningless. Now she is gone. And little cold white thoughts, the snow of my sorrow, drift all about me, blinding me. Now she is gone. And that brings tears to my eyes. I don't know what this figure represents. Another side of my father that I really appreciate. This man wasn't only just confined to making Western landscapes and murals and such. He had the imagination to do these things, these wonderful little paintings. And he invented this name to go along with it, which would be the equivalent of some Polish name, but he called it Dvorak. I didn't know anything about them until one afternoon when I was visiting Edie in San Francisco. She kicked this box out from underneath the desk and said, if you want to use these, you can have them. And inside this box, I think there must be 75 or 80 of these things. I would love to be able to talk to him about them. So, what did you mean here, Dad? What's this all about? I'd love to know what was in his mind when he did that. But that's not possible.
In her early years as a photographer, when she was establishing her portrait studio, she would sometimes talk at the first sitting. She would just be looking in through the camera, but would take no exposure. She'd simply talk to them. So there was no photographs taken. It was simply they were getting to know each other. There's a direct link in the way that she worked in the studio with the rich and the privileged, and the way that she worked in the field with the very poor and underprivileged. My mother never gave people directions. She never said smile. She never said turn your head this way or turn your head that way. But it became an instinct of her subjects to look straight into the camera the way I look at you. And that happens again and again and again and again. And my mother used to say that they took the photographs as much as she did. There was a partnership. she and Ansel Adams got an assignment from Life magazine to go and do to Utah and to do a story which was called Three Mormon Towns. Gunlock was almost a perfect preservation of the pioneer spirit and the Mormon vision. And Tocqueville was a little different because it was a town in twilight. And all of the young men there, none of them stayed there to work. They all went to Las Vegas to work, came back on the weekends. But it was a town that was going to have to change in some way. St. George had gone in a different direction. They didn't dwell on the past in St. George. But in Gunlock and Tocqueville, they did. And it was a way of life that was serene and undisturbed. Really beautiful to see. And my mother's photographs, I think, captured that quality.